morning. Would you stand and worship with us as you're able? There is a river in this forest. There is a fountain that drowns sorrows. There is an ocean deeper than flow. The tide is rising, rising. There is a current stirring deep inside. It's overflowing from the heart of God, the flood of heaven crashing over us. The tide is rising, rising. Bursting, bursting up from the ground. We feel it now. Bursting, bursting up from the ground. We feel it now. We come alive in the river. 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 There's a current stirring deep inside. It's overflowing from the heart of God, the flood of heaven crashing over us. The tide is rising, rising. Bursting, bursting up from the ground. We feel it now. Bursting, bursting up from the ground. We feel it now. We come alive in the river. Yes, we do. We come alive in the river. We come alive in the river. We come alive in the river. Break open prison doors. Set all the captives free. Spring up a well. Spring up a well. Spring up a well in me. Nothing can stop this joy. We're dancing in the streets. Oh, spring up a well. Spring up a well. Spring up a well in me. Would you spring up a well in me, God? Sing, we come alive. We come alive in the river. 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 Oh, spring up a well. 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 We come alive in the river. We come alive in the river. Yeah, we come alive in the river. We come alive in the river. Mark will really just wake you up back there. He does a good job. We're just so glad that you're here. Welcome to New Song. Today we celebrate 19 years together as a family, and we're very excited. Yes. And we celebrate in the best way, donuts. So there are donuts in the back. I had donuts at my wedding instead of cake, and I think that's a wise choice if anybody's getting married soon. It's a good thing. We're going to continue to worship together with singing We're going to sing a song called No Longer Slaves. And this song has meant so much to me over the years. Telling the story of God's faithfulness means that we don't have to fear what comes next, that we don't have to fear the future, that we know that God takes care of us. And so would you sing with us and worship?
You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies till all my fears are gone. And I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. Child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into a family I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God.
Well, as I said before, good morning. Welcome to this living room to celebrate with us God's presence and 19 years of New Song. Would you take just a second to turn to the person next to you, greet them with a hug and a high five, handshake, everything good and boisterous. Nobody dared me to say that word. It just came out naturally. Welcome to those of you joining us online. We're so glad that you're here. We hope you're having a good time celebrating with us. So good morning.
You all may be seated. Good morning and happy 19th birthday to New Song. What a fun day. So I have a handful of announcements for us. The first, maybe most important, is that there are some donuts in the back to celebrate New Song's 19th birthday. And that is, I should just stop there. All right. So there are donuts, coffee, lemonade, water. If this is your first time here, please just feel free to make yourself at home. Get up, get refreshments, get a donut. There's restrooms on either side once you go out the doors. You don't have to go upstairs, but there are bathrooms on both sides. And we are so glad that you are here. A couple of brief reminders for announcements this morning. The first of which is that there is an upcoming Sacred Conversations, and this one is focusing on faith, sexuality, and gender, and it's going to be led by Danielle and Tim. And so if you have questions about that, or if you want to sign up, there's a sign-up form, like Google form, on the New Song Fellowship app. Or you can talk to me, talk to Tim, and we'll get you slotted in there. As a lure to doing that, it's going to be up in this nice new room, is the plan and the hope. And so you can be maybe one of the first people in there since it's been completed. And that feels like a real big deal. And so that's exciting. If for no other reason, sign up, check out the room. But a couple other things. We have two events that are happening, Love Our City events that are happening on September 28th, which is a Saturday. The first is the Granite City Breakfast. New Song's in a rotation of folks, of churches and organizations that serve breakfast in Granite City to whoever shows up, to whoever is needing a nice hot meal or wanting a nice hot meal. And so there's a sign-up sheet in the back, right in that little... right against the wall there. And the second thing is the Unity Fest, which is here in Edwardsville at LeClaire Park, also on that same day. And the Unity Fest happens sort of like I think it's 11 to 4 is the time frame. And so you can sign up to set up or to be at a booth and talk to folks as they come, or to help tear down the booth when the event is over. So those are all of the events that I have. And would you continue in worshiping with us by praying before we hear a sermon? God of our stories, Father of fresh starts, of dewdrop mornings and the crack of the dawn, Spirit of just getting started. 19 years of stories, 19 years of experiences, of change, of growth, of being blessed to be a blessing. You have been good to us. May today we remember and recommit to the path you have led us on, to the vocation you have called this church to be the body, the hands and feet of Christ in our own unique way in this community for all people, in competition with none, allies to all. May our work and our words be towards flourishing, towards harmony, to sing the new song you are singing, ever ancient, ever new, a song of Christ-like justice, of cross-shaped love for all in the transfiguring Spirit. God of the last 19 years, and all years before and all years to come, you are just getting started. To you be all glory and honor and praise now and forevermore. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Grant. What a beautiful prayer. Feels like that was like a 20-year anniversary prayer right there. And that's coming up next year. We look forward to that and celebrating, but we're grateful that you're with us today and celebrating with us 19 years. And please finish off the donuts. Otherwise, I will get back there and there'll be some left and I'll have to eat one, and that's not a good thing. We are thrilled that you're with us. And just a reminder that there's nothing as enticing as walking into a new room. So, ultimately, we're glad you're here today. We continue in the series, Book of Acts, and you will receive power. And this is a story about the first church, the first group of those following the resurrection of Jesus who encounter the work of the Spirit in some ways, unique and dynamic ways, and in other ways that we're meant to see as God at work, doing what he's been doing all along, restoring since the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, what he wants to do, and building a community, an all-inclusive community of love, in which he is its primary sustainer and its most glorious inhabitant. And that's his plan for the world in sort of the most succinct way of saying it. And so the book of Acts is Luke recording for us sort of at that point in history how this major transition in terms of their expectation, in terms of their story, what's happening, not that anything's sort of not a part of what they didn't already expect, as we'll see today, but the paradigm keeps shifting because we grow, we evolve, we continue to become who God wired us to become as individuals, as families, and certainly this community of Christ followers called the ecclesia in their days, which means the called out ones. In their civilization, the ecclesia, it's a Greek word, and it was all those who felt and were called to be a part of making their community better, bringing about a wiser way to live. And that's what the church then is designed to be. That's the name that we carry from this story forward. And so Luke is writing that. We pick up today in Acts chapter 20. We've got just a few chapters left to go. I'm going to cover 3 today for those of you who are like sort of measuring how much more time we have to be in here, or we get to be in here, however you see that. So we got a couple more weeks following today, and hope that you'll join and continue to join us to the end. We pick up in chapter 20 following the story from last week where Paul has been at Ephesus, the city where he spent 2.5 to 3 years, and he's been discipling them, teaching them what it means to be apprentices to Jesus. When we talk about being a follower of Jesus, they would understand that to mean that it comes with this responsibility to say, I'm going to give all and trust all of my life to this Jesus through the Spirit, because Jesus is no longer physically present. But the system, the pattern was essentially 3 simple things. Is to be with the rabbi. That was the system when Jesus was alive. And they're learning then to do that amongst each other, to be with this rabbi Jesus who in spirit is going to guide them into a transformation of who they are becoming from the inside out. That's the purpose of the journey. That's the purpose of following Jesus. More than simply we believe what he believed, we're becoming more like Jesus with every passing day in how we are moving in the world, to be with the rabbi, with Jesus, to become like Jesus in order to be able to do what Jesus did. Which ultimately means when he says the greatest command is to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. When you put really teeth to that, what does it mean to love your neighbor as yourself? For those of you who are making that a pattern of your life, you get that that's really, really hard. It's costly. And so it doesn't just happen because we wake up one day and say, well, I want to feel loving towards my neighbor, especially if my neighbor is, as Jesus called us to, my enemy. But that's the objective. We become the kind of people who naturally learn to love our enemy even, as Jesus did. So we're in the middle of this story where Luke is helping us see what that looks like in this very first church. And so what happens here, Paul has left Ephesus. He's headed back to Jerusalem. It's the season of Pentecost, which is essentially sort of 50 days after this previous feast. And for the Jews, that meant essentially this time of, it's following the Passover. It has relationship then to their feasts and their rituals. For Paul, Pentecost, for the new believers, Pentecost is the day when the Spirit came down and this new ecclesia was born. And so it's a big day for him as both a Jew, but a Jew who he's not formally Jew, he continues to be Jewish, a Jew who is a follower of Jesus. And Pentecost has this rich tradition from his heritage as a Pharisee Jew to now a Christ-following Jew. There's this additional implication of this was the date of the birth of this new community, of the people of the way, as we've been talking about them, as they're described here in this book by Luke. And so Paul comes to Jerusalem knowing this is essentially headed towards the end of the journey of his own life, because he's aware of when he teaches, when he brings about his teaching of the gospel of the kingdom, it creates the same kind of responses. There are those who engage it and trust themselves to it. The light bulb goes off and they say, oh yeah, this makes sense. And there are those then who are riled by it because it appears to them to be contradictory and dissing their whole history. And so the same thing happens again in Jerusalem, as you might expect. Paul comes to Jerusalem, is going through the purification rituals that are needed to enter the temple, to participate in this feast of Passover, these religious obligations. And so it would be a time then, in terms of sort of the context of what's happening in those days, when this feast happened, it was one of the feasts that was required of all male, at least, Jews to come to Jerusalem. Wherever you lived in the world as a Jew, you come to Jerusalem for this festival. So Jerusalem, which typically would have about, science says, or experts say, not science, but sociologists would tell us, about 20 to 30,000 people. When this feast happens, from Passover to this one, there's 3 in a row, about 150 to 200,000 people would gather in Jerusalem. So it was a packed city. Paul goes for the same reason every other male Jew would be there, and probably with their families in most cases. So Paul goes there in order to participate in this, and there's already then, as we start out in chapter 21, this rumor that he is anti-law, that he's anti-Moses. There's already this sense of the story's gotten around, the rumors have gotten around about him. So there's this high suspicion that he's essentially turned his back on the faith and that he's speaking things that are intended to disrupt it, to dishonor it. And they're built around, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, sort of this, one of the teachings is that you don't have to be circumcised anymore to be a follower of Christ, to participate in this faith. And so that's one of the big ones. It's one of the big ones. And so that one is central to the process, even though it doesn't come up in this chapter. They're aware of that. And so in their minds, he's throwing out Moses, who was the prophet. He's throwing out this calling, this distinction of what separated the Jews, particularly the male Jews, in terms of their physical representation of their obedience to God, was this act of circumcision. And Paul is saying, you don't need to do that anymore. So they're reading this as he's discounting everything that's identified us as the people of God for centuries. So it's a bigger deal than it may seem to them. So we pick up in verse 27. Let me get there. Here we are. Chapter 21, verse 27, when the 7 days were nearly over, the days of purification that we talked about, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. So he's there. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So Paul goes through these purification rituals. He goes into the temple already aware that he's probably under suspicion. But he goes because this is what you do as a devout Jew. Even as a devout Jew who's a Christ follower, this is what you're celebrating. This is what you do. This is part of how you express your worship. And so as Paul shows up, he's recognized by some, and the assumption is made that apparently there's some other Greek there, in other words, non-Jew, who's also in the temple with him, who's from Ephesus. Somehow they know that. And the assumption is made, this guy, this is how blasphemy is. He brought that guy, one of those kind of people, into our temple. And so here's the reaction. The whole city was in an uproar. And the people came running from all directions, seizing Paul, the whole city. Remember, how many are there in the city at the time? 150 to 200,000 people. So maybe not all of them, but this is a big, big deal. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So again, sort of a little bit of a pause here. You have to understand that the Romans, when they know all these Jews are going to descend into Jerusalem, that it goes from a city of about 20 to 30,000 to maybe up to 250,000 people, they show up. Because the last thing they want is a bunch of Jews gathered together who may incited by some, want to rebel against the Roman government. Because then you have a big problem on your hands, and the ones in charge of Jerusalem are going to be in big trouble. So lots of troops would have been in the city that normally wouldn't be there. There's a large gathering, and all of a sudden at the temple, the central place of the city, there's this huge uproar, and somebody's being beaten and trying to be killed, so the Romans want to pay attention to what's happening. Does that make sense? The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing, some another, and since the commander could not get the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" Because Paul's teaching is so threatening, the teaching about the way of Jesus, the gospel, what Jesus calls, what the gospel is called, the gospel of the kingdom, is so transformative and in some ways appears to those devout Jews to be conflictive with theirs. It creates this uproar once again. It threatens the whole system to the degree that you have however many of these people are shouting once again for him to be killed. And so specifically here in the context of temple and the assumption of him having brought an outsider into it is the trigger, is the thing that sets him off. And so let's pause just a minute here and let me give you some context why this is so significant for them. Why this matters so much. This one idea, the one assumption matters so much. And so from the history that we have from the Old Testament in terms of their view of God, the Jews' view of God and God's closest to them and the way that God is in their midst, you may remember in the story of once they leave Egypt and they escape from Egypt, that in the desert they build a tabernacle. And so they have this tent. And so it's surrounded by this whole sort of fence, and the tent's on the inside. And the tent is the place, this is called the tabernacle. The temple is the place, this tent, where God dwells in some way with you. It's where God dwells. It's where they had the Ark of the Covenant. It's in this space, in that place, where the high priest could enter once a year to offer sacrifice to God, to sort of commune with God, because God would be there. And no one else could enter upon penalty of death. None of the other priests, nobody else. Once a year, the priest could enter the Holy of Holies because God would meet him there. And so this is a very special place, an anointed place, very sacred space to them. And they took this so seriously that if the priest were to enter, and for some reason, they would, at least tradition says, they had a rope tied to his foot. So if for some reason he had messed up and died in there, they could pull him out, because if they went in to get him, they would likely die as well. So this is a very sacred space. This is what happens in the desert. So when they finally have their own place to live, Solomon builds a temple. We have this temple in the time of Jesus is the second temple, because the first one got destroyed. So in this second temple then is the temple that they're talking about. And this is where this comes from, the idea of a tabernacle that then becomes a temple, which is then called Bet Yahweh. Bet being house, Yahweh God, the house of God. Or Bet Elohim. Also Elohim is another word for God. Bet Elohim, this is the house of God. And so they literally understood this to be, their temple was the place where God dwelled with them. God, the God of all creation, is present with them in ways that he's not present anywhere else in this temple. Does that make sense? And so the language is important here because it begins to shape our understanding of the nature of the temple. Why they're so riled that they believe Paul brought Trophimus, this Greek, into it. This is the place where God dwelt in some way. He is close. He is here. He's present. It's not just the place where God is worshipped. It's not just this one building like so many other buildings where you can go anytime and we worship God. It's the place where God shows up and calls home. So the temple, this idea of a house, implies some things, as it does for us on a much sort of lighter way. In that sense, this is God's home. It's his house. It's where he is. And so who gathers typically in a house? the family, right? The family is every family has this sort of sense of this is our house, this is our home. And sometimes then, what do they do when they gather? They have some food. In this case, in the temple, they have a barbecue. They celebrate. They have this offering. They have the sacrifice of meat. They sacrifice meat. They bring grain. And so it's celebrated and feasted upon by the priests and the people sometimes. And so this is kind of what's expected. In the Father's house, then, all his sons and daughters gather to celebrate. That's the point of these feasts. However, as in some way or another, any other household, there are some house rules, either overt or implied, maybe. So all of our houses have some kind of house rules, either overt and implied. How many of you sort of the house rule is when you walk in, you take your shoes off? Anybody? Yeah, a handful of folks. And so again, it's not like one of those, you do it, you walk in and you just do it. Somebody else comes in and maybe they feel a little uncomfortable. Do I take my shoes off? Do I take it, do I not take them off? And sometimes it's like, no, it doesn't matter. We know this, if you're not comfortable, it's fine. But it's this unspoken house rule. Or maybe it's no TV during dinner or something else. In our house, one of the unspoken rules, but the line very clearly drawn is no hats in the house. And I was often guilty of breaking that one because I like to wear a hat. We had this house rule, actually it's kind of a soft house rule. It's more of a joke house rule. When we'd have guests that we knew well come to our house the first time and all our kids were together, and we'd sit down to pray, to have a meal, we pray. And so we as a family would sort of put our hands up and touch sort of all the way around. Act like we're going to pray, like touching hands, just because we thought it was funny to see how they'd react to that. So the house rule more was that as a joke, not that we prayed that way. But essentially, the idea is there are special distinctions or privileges that come for those counted as family. These are the rules that apply to us. You walk in, you feel at home, you know sort of what is implied in terms of how you live in the space in a way that honors the space, honors the group that's there. So for the house of God, how do you approach God? And how often? We're part of the house rules and their customs. And these for them are very important questions, very important issues. In the midst of these practices, there's always then this underlying tension. As a monotheistic faith, in other words, as the singular faith in its day that was worshiped one God, there were no other people that worshiped just one God. It was part of the distinction of the Hebrew people, that they were monotheistic. They worshiped the one true God. And so it's unique in its day, and so there is this one God, the God of the Jews and the God of all people. And so we have to have some house rules that somehow accommodate that, which takes them back then to Abraham and God's covenant with Abraham that told him basically, so I'm going to bless you, and through you I will bless all nations. As part of the ongoing story until he returns is the expectation that this is a God for all people, beginning with the Jews, beginning with Abraham, but it's intended to be the God for all people. So they live with this sort of sense of knowing that's who we're supposed to be, it's who we're becoming. There's this evolution of who we are, but for now, in this place, in this time, there is a temple, and God has his house rules, and God shows up here, and so we take this seriously, who comes in and who doesn't come in, and how they come in, and how they approach matters, because this is his home. And so this is, in some ways, a faith in transition, but traditions don't always transition so easily, do they? So they built this temple to reflect that. This is the house of God, and so it's sort of the brick and mortar version of the tent in the wilderness. And so I came across a 3D sort of drawing of it, which I thought was pretty interesting, just to kind of give us some idea. And so here is essentially the view of what Jerusalem would have looked like according to the artist drawing this picture. And this is the temple, essentially the largeness of sort of how this whole thing is built out. And we won't go through all the details, but to give you a scope of how large it was in terms of the city, if you pull this picture up, you begin to see, maybe the next one, that there are people in it. This is a massive, massive building, as you can see in terms of the scope of the whole city. So if we sort of zoom in to the temple part of that, what you see is there's some little dots on the outside of where the walls start to go up, and those are actual people. So this is how story is. The temple in its tallest place in the middle is 3 stories tall. And that is the temple itself, inside of which is the Holy of Holies. The rest of that then is outer courts, and each of these courts, sort of outside the walls, are the courts of the Gentiles. If you're a Gentile, you can come here and no further. And then you walk through the first door, and you have the court of women. So the women could take the next step in because the Gentiles are sort of the ones farthest on the outside. And in that society, women were the next ones, sort of farthest on the outs. They could only come so far. You go through the next door and you have the court of Israel, which is where all the Israel men were allowed to be. And the next door would be where all the priests could be, where the sacrifices were made. And then you had the door. You can see sort of a little bit closer there, a door to the Holy of Holies. The tall building in the middle is the temple, is the place where only the priest, the high priest, could go once a year, where God would meet them in the Holy of Holies. And so you have it's essentially this massive structure, beautiful structure, intended to be the space where the people of Israel would meet their God, who once a year would come and meet them, and their sins would be absolved. And so you have all these rules of who can approach, who can get how far and no farther, because the house rules come at a cost if you disobey them. And so on the outer side of that, between the court of the Gentiles, the ones on the furthest out, and the next level, is this sign. Can you read what it says? Okay, maybe let me sort of enhance that. See if you can. Okay, can you read it now? Well, this one's in Greek, but they also had them in Latin. Here's what it basically says. No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade, which is essentially the wall, and the plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow. This is a warning to the Gentiles. This is your court. This is your court. You walk through this next door, and you will be put to death, and it'll be your fault. Because, yeah, you're welcome to join us, but only so far, at the penalty of death. So this is obviously before they had church greeters, where they could say, come on in, come so far. Don't go through that next door, because it'll cost you your life, but we're glad you're here today. So before we jump to conclusions, this is the house rule. These house rules are actually obedience to the Torah. They're obeying what they've been taught to do. In the formative stages of who they were becoming, there needed to be a hard line of you are to be different than all other nations. And so that comes as a rule that isn't intended to be for all time, and they would know that because they know. For in terms of the God of Abraham, the goal is that he'll bless all nations. But traditions become hard-trenched, and so this is the warning. It comes from Torah. And so it's a hard thing to move past the rules that feel like they've always been the way they are, and they should always be the same moving forward. And maybe this is no different. It defines, it gives them some sense of identity. And so back to the story, we're there in Jerusalem in the height of this celebration, in the height of this massive amount of people there. And so Paul is accused of violating the house rules, basically. This is the guy who brought that Greek into the temple. This is how much he's willing to desecrate what is most sacred to us. Do you get the gravity a bit more? Sure. So we pick up in verse 37. The soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks. He asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" The commander responds, "Do you speak Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Apparently, historians tell us, Josephus says that happened. They don't know who it was, but that's who this commander thinks he is. Paul answers, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." So Paul's going to address this crowd. After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps, motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, their language, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." And so Paul retells, in the following verses, Paul retells the story of his conversion that we've heard before in Luke already, where he pulls together this chapter of who he actually is, who he was, how they would have known him to be, and how that then ultimately leads him to become a Christ follower who isn't shedding that, is reframing his understanding of who's in and who's out in light of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the gospel of the kingdom has opened his eyes to, no, this is sort of broader, bigger than just for us. And so Luke gives us that story once again as an emphasis. We pick up in verse 17. He says, when I returned to Jerusalem, was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the first example we see of throwing dirt at somebody, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. In other words, they're like, we knew it. You're on their side. You're not one of us, no matter what you say. You're the apostle to the Gentiles, those kind of people. And so maybe the question is, so is Paul pro-Gentile and anti-Jewish? Which would mean the implication is there's us and there's them, the age-old paradigm for humankind. And so we get more details later in some of Paul's writings. He writes to the Romans and writing to them that they need to understand essentially what he's saying, what's going on, how this works. In Romans 8, Paul writes this, for those who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. The Spirit you receive does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. I'm no longer a slave, no longer in need to fear. Rather, the Spirit you received brought your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. Abba in Hebrew is a word like calling God Dad. It's a term of endearment. By him we cry, Dad, Father. He's writing to the Romans, remember. To the Roman believers, the oppressors are getting this announcement that they can call Paul's God Dad. He's saying you are sons and daughters included in the family, and you get to call him Dad. Shelley and I have known each other since we were 12, 13 years old, and grew up in Argentina, as almost all of you know. Our parents were both missionaries. And so in all my growing up years, her dad, Toby, was always Uncle Toby to me, because all the other missionaries were uncle and aunt this and that. And so I grew up calling my in-laws now Uncle Toby and Aunt Janet. And so when I got married, it was this really surreal experience of moving from Uncle Toby to Dad. Felt a little, weird in some ways. He's my uncle, but he's also my dad. But there was a sense for me of like this joy of getting to call this man that I loved Dad. To this day, I'm so grateful that Toby isn't just my father-in-law, that he's Dad. And he's been that for now 40 plus years. So there's this sense in which there's this invitation into an intimacy. And Paul is saying to the Romans, you get to call him Dad. Our God, the one who's been our Father, is now your Father too. All of you. So might that be to these Jews in the temple a bit threatening if your house rules imply you are his children? No one else is. We get to call him Abba, Father. You don't. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul writes, for he himself, speaking of Jesus, is our peace, who has made the two groups, Jews and Gentiles, one. Because for Jews, it's the Jews, and Gentiles is everybody else in the world, not Jew. He's made them one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, a reference to the walls of this temple. He's destroyed that barrier. It's no longer, the building may be there, but that barrier doesn't exist anymore. There's no need for hostility. It's a reference to those warning signs that we saw. Hostility is no longer acceptable by either side, in either direction, because of Jesus. You're all sons and daughters. Because remember, the goal is God building, God growing, God restoring what he always wanted, an all-inclusive community of love in which he was the primary sustainer and most glorious inhabitant. No more territorial disputes, no more comparisons, no more jealousy. All the challenges and struggles of a blended family. Paul writes to the Galatians, and in different words is saying the same thing. He says, in Christ's family, there can be no division into Jew and non-Jew, slave and free, male and female. Among us, you are all equal. That is, we are all in a common relationship with Jesus Christ. Also, since you are in Christ's family, then you are Abraham's famous descendants, his descendant heirs, according to the covenant promises. So what's the big deal with letting the Gentiles join them? I mean, they knew this day was coming, right? I mean, all the way back to Abraham, they knew this would happen at some point to some degree. Isn't this perhaps a major overreaction? Some of that is that, again, that gap of real understanding of context some 2,000 years later. When we read the scriptures and think of the word Gentiles, perhaps we have this vague sense of thinking as being simply people who just didn't believe the same things. Sort of they had a different faith tradition, different background. And that reading is, in some ways, read through a more modern lens of, call it tolerance as a backdrop, is our way to tend to see it. But this is, you see, again, for these Jewish people, has been their identity for a few thousand years. No sibling rivalry. It's simply us. It's us. We are the people of God. We are brothers and sisters, siblings under God. He is our Father, set apart. And there's all kinds of laws and traditions set up so that they can be the display of what a relationship with God looks like to the rest of the world. And it's been hard drawn that way for thousands of years. And so the Gentiles were those in their mind and their experience were the pagans. And not all of them were the same, but it would conjure up, to some degree for them, those are the people who worship idols, things made of stone and wood and clay. But it's not just that. It includes, many of them, it includes all kinds of other sort of rituals that are essentially, they're blasphemous from the respect of our God. They include explicit sexual rites, baby sacrifices, some of them. So they are not just those kind of people. They're those kind of people who have these very broken, these very tragic, these very explicit, whatever language they would use to say, those practices make them sort of the farthest removed. And Paul is saying that God is saying, if you come to me, you get to call me Dad. And so maybe we have a little bit more of that, I get it. I can see that a bit clearer now. Maybe they have a point. And that's why this story is so significant. Because this isn't just about what some walls between people who happen to have a few minor differences of opinion or interpretation of the law or tradition have. This is a word for all of us who tend to want walls between us and them. Those people, whoever might be in that category for us. To recognize our tendency to put people in categories and assign them to a certain space or group with a particular label based on our perceptions of their worth in our eyes or maybe even God's eyes. So that ultimately, bottom line is so that we, like the Jews in the temple, can feel safe, believing that we are right, or better, we're the ones who are in, which in the end is merely a buffer from our own anxiety and fear about the possibility that it might just be us on the outside. A fear that sinks in deep into our bones when you're trying to find the right table to sit your first day at middle school. Where is the place that I belong? Where's the place that I'm safe? Where are the people that I can call my people? Because I know intuitively they're the tables that I'm not welcome at. And it brings into focus the anger and the arrogance behind the notion that those kind of people should get the same opportunity, the same invitation to come home, to become like us, all of us, sons and daughters. And so maybe at this point, for some of us, there's a voice in our head saying, but they've done terrible things. I mean, they made some bad choices, maybe horrible choices. While I, on the other hand, have been faithful to follow the rules. I mean, I'm living sort of a better life in that sense, diligently seeking to live up to what's expected as a child of God, a son or a daughter of God. And still the Father welcomes them into his house, his family. And maybe we'd recognize that voice with a little bit of reflection. Because we've heard this story before, most if not all of us. It's the voice of what we might call the older brother. The story that Luke tells in Luke 15. We call it the parable of the prodigal son, but this is really a story about an older brother. And those of us on the inside sort of can understand from the perspective of that story. It's a story, if you remember, of two brothers and a father. And so the younger brother decides he wants to sort of explore the world and take on sort of his own life. And so he goes to the father and says, hey, give me my part of the inheritance, which in those days would have been the extreme sense of shame and disrespect to his father. The community would have turned against him because he shamed his father by saying, it's because essentially what he's saying is, I wish you were dead because that's how you get an inheritance. You see, if you were dead, then I get what's mine, so I want it now. In other words, implied just beneath the text is, so why don't you act like you're dead and give me what's mine, and I'll go and do what I want to do. To which, again, the community response, which is a shame-based culture, would have been, let go of that dude. Mourn his loss. He's no longer your son. Cut him out. And if you know the story, you know what happens. He goes and does his thing, loses it all, decides to come back, and is rehearsing his speech to come back. Father, I've dishonored you. Will you take me back? Before he can get it out, on the horizon, the father is pacing the porch, watching to see, hoping, praying that son will come back. And as he sees him, he runs towards the son. Now, this is, again, context. Put this into context. He doesn't have shorts on. He didn't come from playing pickleball. He's wearing a robe. He would have had to gather his robe. To run, he would have had to gather his robe and lift it above his knees, exposing probably some of his thighs, his legs, and run. That was a shameful act for a man to do. The father shames himself to make sure the son knows, you are welcome home. I'm your dad. So the older brother who's working in the field hears this big commotion. They're having this big party. The son has come home, and he comes home, and he's angry. How could you give him back his right to be a son? Because he gets the ring on the finger and the robe, and they get this huge party that the whole town gets invited to because my son was lost, and now he's back. And so the son is mad. He's not coming to the party. The father goes off to talk to him. And the story just ends kind of like with a mic drop moment of the son just refuses to come back. And it doesn't go anywhere from there. This is a story Jesus tells in the presence of, for the benefit of, or for the hearing of the religious leaders of the day. For this very reason of what's happening in the temple. The older brother wants nothing to do with the party, nothing to do with the son. And those of us on the inside can often have a strong tendency to be brothers, the older brothers. But you see, here's the real agenda, the hidden agenda of the older brother. It's not just mad because his brother's back. What's happening is he didn't really value the relationship with his father because of his love for his father. He obeyed the father, wanted a relationship with him for what the father could give him, what the father could do for him. His relationship to his father gave him respect, status, possessions, validation as being the good son as compared to that other one. And so when those things are at risk, they often come along with quite a bit of anger. I'm no longer special if you get to be a sibling in equal standing. All my efforts to be the good child sort of get washed. And so let's pull this together and ask the always important question, where are you in this story? Where are you in this story? Perhaps some of you identify with the outsiders, feeling like there's a wall and a threat that's keeping you from receiving the embrace of the Heavenly Father. Perhaps it's the voices of your past or your encounters with older brothers that have hurt you, reminded you of your greatest fear, which might be if God really knew who I am and what I've done, what I struggle with, the questions and doubts that I carry, He probably would never welcome me into His family, to be one of His children, to call Him Dad. I'm not sure if I want Him to. So if that's you, hear this. Hear this. Jesus died. And Paul is knowingly, willingly willing to face death, to make absolutely clear the absolute truth that God will meet you as you are, where you are, to embrace you and love you as a full sibling in His family, for whom He has given it all that you might become in Him the you He created you to be. For others of us, are we beginning to see any of the older brother tendencies that might be in our words or our ways of seeing others? Perhaps we can find it sometimes a little too easy to categorize, to group, to label people. Those who for some reason or another make us uncomfortable, cause us to feel threatened. Maybe they don't like you, maybe they don't have the same political or religious perspective. Maybe it's as simple as I just don't care for them, which is more acceptable language for dismissing them. Or perhaps we see them as less deserving because they've made their choices, now they got to live with them. For those of us older brothers, we would do well to remember that when Jesus is questioned by the chief priests and elders, that is, the older brothers, in Matthew 21, He says to them this, "Truly I tell you, that the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you." Which essentially is to say this: the younger siblings who are longing to love their father and be loved by him, the rebels, the misfits, the outcasts and broken who are waking up and walking into my house and being seated at the banquet while you stand outside. And we might add, angry. In the end, there are times when we all will have the tendency to be one or the other. Older sisters and brothers or younger sisters and brothers, either too ashamed or broken to believe the offer of acceptance is real, or believing that we're more deserving, so we get busy throwing dirt. All the while, the Father stands waiting at the door, watching the horizon, waiting for each of us, all of us, to enter His house. All of us, sons and daughters. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray for eyes to see and ears to hear for all of us of our place in this story. It's more than a historical event and something that happened to Paul way back then that was the beginning of the end for him. but as an all too common human story that in one way or another we all find ourselves in or have experienced one side or the other. I pray for those who feel like or have been treated like the outsiders, the younger siblings, who have been marginalized, put to the side, and dismissed, overlooked, attacked. I pray that your Spirit would come close, whispering to their soul that you're their dad. That they would sense that as they are where they are, they're loved. And if they want it, that they are welcome into their house, into your house. The same way all are welcome, with open arms. For those of us, Father, who are, have been, or will be in spaces of seeing, being, acting like, feeling like older siblings, when we've done that, we ask that you forgive us, to give us eyes to see the destruction, the brokenness, the sadness that it brings you to see us treating each other that way. Give us eyes to see all others, either as siblings or as potential siblings if they'd be drawn to you, to see them as worthy as any of us are, to be called your sons and daughters, your children. To be gracious and hopeful that someday they'll call you Dad. We thank you that we can take on your name, that we're invited into your house. We can take on your DNA to become like Christ, not to become gods, to become who you made us to be, your children, made in your image, with the destiny, Father, to participate in the expansion and growth and rule of your creation for all of eternity. And through Jesus, you've given us that opportunity. So we thank you for all that you've done, all that you are. We thank you for Paul for upholding this truth. We thank you for the Father who meets us all where we are and invites us into his home to belong. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. One more quick thing I want to put to you as part of our New Song family, New Song community. Shift gears just a little bit here. And that is one of our staff members, Christina Heckelman. Many of you know her. She's the directs Kingdom City and is often down there on Sundays. So if you haven't met her, you've met her for sure if you've got parents that are kids that are down there. But she's a very valued part of who we are. Christina is going to be participating, is signed up for a cohort to happen over the next year. And so essentially, what I want to give is give you a little bit of intro about what that means. Christina, as an Asian American woman, has been in this process of trying to discover who she is in terms of what that means for her and her faith and her journey, both as a Christ follower as well as her role as a staff member here. And so a few months ago, it led her to participate in, she found this cohort for Asian American women, Pacific Island women, who are going to be mentored, can have a place over this year to have, essentially it covers a couple of trips that she'll make to California for some in-house teaching, but a year-long learning to identify her own story in ways that can maximize who she is and how she brings her full self as an Asian American woman to the table here as a family. And so in light of that, our funds here at New Song for staff development are limited, as you would expect, as you know, sort of always is. But we want her to be able to do that at no cost to her. It's an expensive kind of ordeal. And so we want to invite you to seriously, prayerfully consider participating in that. Sort of you get a picture of, obviously, if you haven't met Christina, that's her. And she does an amazing job with the kids. I'm sure if you've seen her, you know she is kind-hearted, she's loving, and this is a really important journey for her, a journey that is sort of unknown to me as a white male here in this country. And so we want to support her in that. In terms of all sons and daughters are equal, we're delighted that Christina has this space and place to find a way of participating in a cohort that can help her become all that she's meant to be in the journey. It'll be a year-long cohort, as I said, 2 in-person retreats, online gatherings through the fall and spring. And so there'll be travel and housing for 2 trips to California, 2 semesters worth of learning. So as the Spirit leads you to participating in helping her fund that, we would greatly appreciate that. She would greatly appreciate that. And we wanted to invite you to participate in the joy of giving in that way too, as the Lord led you. So there's that if you want to. I see some phones already. So if you want to take, we'll leave that up there for the service if you want to, or you can call and ask more questions. You feel free to ask Christine about it. She's given us permission to be able to share this with you. And so while this journey is delicate in some ways, it's also very exciting for her as it is for us as we see her be able to become all that she's meant to be as part of our New Song family and part of our staff leadership here as well. So prayerfully consider that as well. As is with every week, it's a significant part of worship. If you're part of the New Song family, came prepared to worship and giving, we have joy boxes around the walls and online. Grace and peace. We'll see you next week.